The state of South Carolina has executed death row inmate Michael Mahdi. Mahdi chose death by firing squad.
Mahdi was convicted of killing an off-duty police officer in 2004. He is now the second South Carolina death row inmate to be executed by firing squad.
On April 11, 2025, Michael Mahdi was led into the execution chamber at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He was 42 years old, strapped into a metal chair facing a wall with 3 rectangular openings. A white target with a red bullseye was placed over his heart. At 6 o'clock in the evening, without warning or countdown, 3 volunteer corrections officers fired simultaneously from 15 feet away. 4 minutes later, at 6:05, Michael was pronounced dead, ending a 21-year wait from sentencing to execution. Michael faced execution for the murder of Captain James Edward Myers, killed on July 18, 2004, in Calhoun County, South Carolina. Captain Myers, 56, was a 30-year veteran of the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety, a devoted husband who had married Amy Tripp just 15 months earlier, and a father and grandfather who had spent his final day celebrating birthdays at the beach with his family. He was ambushed in his own shed, the same shed where he and his wife Amy had married, shot 9 times with his own rifle, and set on fire by a desperate fugitive who had already killed 2 men in 3 days across 3 states. Michael's execution would make him South Carolina's 5th execution in 8 months, and only the 2nd person executed by firing squad in the state's modern history. But before we examine that final day, there is a story that needs to be told. A story about a boy from Lawrenceville, Virginia, who witnessed his father attempt to murder his mother at age 9. About a child who spent 8,000 hours in solitary confinement during the years his brain should have been developing. And about 3 families, the Joneses, the Boggs, and the Myers, who lost loved ones to violence that decades of systemic failure had done nothing to prevent. This is the story of Michael Mahdi. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, the darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Michael Mahdi entered the world on March 20, 1983, in Virginia. His father, born Thomas Burwell, had transformed himself into Sharif Mahdi after converting to Islam. Sharif's own childhood had been marked by dysfunction and alcoholism that ran through his family like poison. He dropped out of high school and joined the Marines, receiving an honorable discharge before struggling to find his place in civilian life. At 27, Sharif entered an arranged marriage with a 16-year-old girl from Richmond. The age gap foreshadowed the control and violence that would define their relationship. They had 2 sons, first Salim, then Michael. The small home in Lawrenceville, Virginia, became a prison of fear for the young family. Sharif's grandmother later revealed a devastating truth. All 5 of her children, including Sharif's mother, were conceived through rape. Depression and emotional detachment marked the upbringing of Sharif and his siblings. This cycle of trauma would repeat itself in the next generation. Young Michael witnessed scenes no child should see. His earliest memory was of his father grabbing his mother Vera and slamming her through a glass coffee table. The sound of shattering glass mixed with his mother's screams. "Bitch, you wanted the damn table. You got it!" Sharif shouted as 3-year-old Michael pleaded with him to stop. The violence continued for months. Sharif couldn't hold a job, moving the family constantly. At one point, he forced his wife and sons to live in the woods on his mother's rural property, rather than accept her help in town. The boys had irregular school attendance and massive gaps in their education. Basic needs went unmet as Sharif cycled through temporary work and unemployment. When Michael was 4 years old, Vera could take no more. But Sharif had made his position clear. He would kill their sons before allowing her to take them. So Vera fled alone in 1987, leaving Michael and Salim behind. Sharif told the boys their mother didn't love them. Later, he told them she was dead. Sharif proved incapable of single parenthood. He paid little attention to his sons, leaving them unsupervised for hours and sometimes days. When Mikhail was in elementary school, Sharif sent him to live with relatives while Salim went to Texas. Sharif couldn't provide the most basic supervision or care. 8-year-old Mikhail moved to Baltimore to live with his paternal uncle Carson and Aunt Lawanda Burwell. Carson spent time teaching Mikhail to read and helping with homework. The boy attended Scotts Branch Elementary School for 2nd and 3rd grade. Teachers noted he was active but had severe disciplinary problems and difficulty respecting authority. His reading and writing skills fell far below grade level. School reports documented low self-esteem and troubled relationships with classmates. Despite these challenges, one teacher saw potential in the troubled child. The summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, Mikhail visited his father in Virginia. What happened during that visit would shatter what little stability the boy had found in Baltimore. Sharif Mahdi had not given up on controlling Vera. For 2 years after she fled in 1987, he remained obsessed with the woman he considered his property. The Islamic faith he claimed to follow taught respect and dignity for women, but Sharif's interpretation was warped by mental illness and a pathological need for control. When Mikhail was 9 years old, living with Uncle Carson and Aunt Lawanda in Baltimore, Sharif arranged for the boys to visit him in Virginia during the summer of 1992. Mikhail and his brother Salim had been told for years that their mother was dead. Sharif had repeatedly said she didn't love them, that she had abandoned them, that she was gone forever. The boys had mourned a mother they could barely remember. During that summer visit, Sharif revealed a devastating truth. Your mother isn't dead. She's alive. The revelation shattered the boys' world. For years they had believed she was gone. They had processed grief and accepted her death. Now they learned it was all a lie. Their mother was alive, and their father had hidden this from them. Sharif had contacted Vera, telling her that her sons wanted to see her. Despite her fear of him, the pull of seeing her children was overwhelming. She agreed to meet. What Mikhail and Salim didn't know was that Sharif planned to use them as bait. Sharif also brought his mother Nancy Burwell and his sister to the meeting location. When Vera arrived, Sharif immediately attacked her. Sharif then took Vera to the woods and assaulted her. 9-year-old Mikhail watched as his father grabbed his mother and began beating her viciously. The attack happened in full view of the children before Sharif dragged Vera away. During the assault, Sharif made a chilling statement. He said he was going to cut her head off and give it to the Imam. There's nowhere in Islam where you do shit like that. My ego, I was offended. The ego gets involved, and sexual jealousy, you know, it makes you crazy. Vera escaped with help from Sharif's mother and sister. The specific details of how the escape unfolded are not provided in available sources, but the result was clear. Vera survived and fled to safety, once again leaving her sons behind. Not by choice, but because staying meant death. For Mikhail, witnessing his father's attempted murder of his mother created catastrophic psychological damage. He had just learned she was alive, only to watch his father try to kill her. His father had used him as bait in an attempted murder. His mother had escaped, but left him behind again with his abuser. After the incident, Mikhail returned to Baltimore with Uncle Carson and Aunt Lawanda. The boy who came back was profoundly changed. Shortly after his return, during homework one evening, Aunt Lawanda became frustrated with Mikhail's refusal to complete assignments. She whipped him as punishment, discipline that many parents of that era considered normal. But for Mikhail, the physical punishment triggered a crisis. Immediately after the whipping, 9-year-old Mikhail called the police. When the officer arrived, Mikhail asked him, "Can I have your gun? I want to shoot myself." The officer recognized this as a serious mental health emergency and contacted authorities. The incident led to Mikhail's commitment to the Walter P. Carter Center, a psychiatric facility in Baltimore. This was his second psychiatric hospitalization. He had been admitted once before in 2nd grade after telling school officials he wanted to shoot himself. At the Walter P. Carter Center, mental health professionals diagnosed Mikhail with major depression, single episode. The diagnosis was documented in his discharge papers dated October 19, 1992. During therapy sessions, staff asked Mikhail what he would wish for if granted 3 wishes. Mikhail's answer revealed the depth of his pain. "I wish my family could be back together." When asked what he would wish for if that couldn't happen, Mikhail's response was chilling. "I would jump off a bridge, shoot myself, or kill myself with my bow and arrows." A 9-year-old child with multiple specific suicide plans. The mental health professionals recognized this as a psychiatric emergency requiring intensive intervention. But after 2 months at Walter P. Carter, Mikhail was discharged in October 1992. The discharge summary noted his depression diagnosis and recommended ongoing therapy. There was nowhere for him to go except back to his father. Uncle Carson and Aunt Lawanda felt they could no longer handle Mikhail's behavioral and psychological issues. Vera wasn't in a position to take custody. She was still recovering from Sharif's attack and trying to establish stability for herself while living in fear. Mikhail was sent back to Brunswick County, back to the isolated property, back to Sharif's care. He returned to the man who had used him as bait in an attempted murder, who was deeply mentally ill himself and getting worse. Sharif's mental health had deteriorated further. Years later, he would be formally diagnosed with schizophrenia. His paranoia and isolation had intensified. His ability to maintain employment or provide basic care for his sons had worsened. When Mikhail returned to school in Brunswick County, he entered 5th grade. His teacher, Carol Wilson, immediately recognized that something was profoundly wrong. Mikhail was quiet and withdrawn, keeping to himself. She couldn't get any joy, interest, or motivation out of him. He clearly needed specialized help for his emotional problems. Wilson worked with the school psychologist to get Mikhail support. They recommended he receive extra services and potentially be placed in special education for emotional disturbances. They wanted to provide counseling, smaller class sizes, and more individualized attention. When Wilson and the school psychologist brought these recommendations to Sharif in a parent-teacher conference, his response was explosive. Sharif stormed out of the school, refusing to allow any intervention. Shortly after that meeting, Sharif pulled both Mikhail and Salim from public school entirely, claiming he would homeschool them. Sharif's version of homeschooling had nothing to do with education. Sharif's idea of homeschooling was paramilitary and survivalist training in the woods, reinforced with conspiracy-laden rants. He filled his sons' heads with theories about a coming New World Order and told them that white folks were coming to kill them. This isolation from normal society and constant reinforcement of paranoid, violent thinking pushed Mikhail further from any chance at a normal childhood. At age 11, Sharif had effectively ended his son's formal education. The boy who had already survived abandonment, abuse, and multiple suicide attempts was now being trained for a war that existed only in his mentally ill father's imagination. By December 1997, 14-year-old Mikhail committed his first crime, breaking and entering. He was convicted of 2 counts of grand larceny and 2 counts of breaking and entering. During an evaluation, Mikhail told a counselor that his only strength was robbing people. The juvenile justice system had an opportunity to intervene and provide the help Mikhail desperately needed. Instead, it became another source of trauma. Mikhail was sent to a juvenile detention facility. Rather than receiving mental health treatment, education, or rehabilitative services, he was subjected to extended periods in solitary confinement. Between ages 14 and 17, Mikhail spent over 1,800 hours alone in isolation. 10 times he was isolated for 4 to 5 consecutive days. 7 additional times he was isolated for 2 to 3 consecutive days. The infractions that led to this isolation were often minor: refusing to participate in physical training, shouting and cursing, untucking his shirt, or ripping pages out of a book. These were typical behaviors of a traumatized adolescent, but instead of receiving therapeutic intervention, Mikhail received punishment that amounted to torture. When Mikhail expressed suicidal thoughts in detention, staff placed him in isolation. At age 16, Mikhail attempted to electrocute himself while in custody. He was placed on suicide watch, then returned to the same environment. His depression and hopelessness deepened. Virginia wouldn't stop using this type of solitary confinement on juveniles until 2021. 17 years too late for Miqal Mahdi. After his release from the juvenile facility, Miqal went to live with his mother Vera in Richmond. He had been told for years that she was dead, then witnessed his father's attempt to kill her. The reunion was complicated and fraught with unresolved trauma. Miqal had spent most of his life between ages 14 and 18 in custody, denied education, denied treatment, and subjected to isolation that damaged his developing brain. On November 23, 2000, 17-year-old Miqal encountered a Richmond police officer. During the confrontation, Miqal attempted to grab the officer's gun. When arrested, he told another officer named Kohler that he should have killed that crazy bitch, referring to his mother. Why he said that, we cannot tell. The violence and hatred that had defined his childhood were now manifesting in his own behavior. But the most serious incident came on April 17, 2001. Moises Rivera, a maintenance supervisor, discovered Miqal standing outside a window to an apartment where he didn't live. When Rivera approached, Miqal immediately attacked him. During the fight, Miqal pulled out a knife and began stabbing. He struck Rivera once in the arm and 5 times in the back, puncturing one of his lungs. Rivera took 3 steps after the attack, then collapsed, coughing up blood. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors saved his life. Miqal was convicted of malicious wounding and sentenced to 93 months in prison, nearly 8 years. 21-year-old Miqal Mahdi walked out of Wallens Ridge State Prison on May 12, 2004. He had served 39 months for stabbing Moises Rivera nearly to death, and he had spent an additional 8 months in solitary confinement that worsened his already severe mental illness. When Miqal was released on probation in May 2004, he was a young man damaged beyond repair. Those 2 months between his release and mid-July represented the final window, the last opportunity for intervention, for treatment, for any chance at redemption. But Miqal received no intensive supervision, no mental health treatment, no job training, no support system. He returned to his grandmother's neighborhood in Lawrenceville, Virginia. Miqal became involved with 2 other men in a plan to eliminate competition in Southern Virginia's drug market. The details of this scheme remained murky, but it led to violence on July 14, 2004. That day, a man later identified as Greg Jones was involved in a drug deal gone wrong in Brunswick County, Virginia. The deal took place near Miqal's home, about 2 miles away. What exactly happened during that transaction would never be fully established, but the result was clear. Greg Jones was stabbed to death. After killing Jones, Miqal went to his grandmother's neighbor's house. He stole a .380 caliber pistol. Then he went to another location and stole a station wagon along with Virginia license plates. He was preparing to run. Miqal knew police would soon connect him to Jones's murder. Rather than face arrest, he decided to flee Virginia entirely. He loaded the stolen gun and license plates into the stolen car and drove south, leaving his home state behind. Now, armed and desperate, Miqal headed toward North Carolina. He had no specific destination, no plan beyond escaping Virginia. The .380 caliber pistol sat within easy reach as he drove through the night. Behind him lay one body and a murder weapon that tied him to the crime. Ahead lay decisions that would leave more victims and seal his own fate. The drive from Lawrenceville to Winston-Salem takes about 3 hours. Miqal spent that time knowing he was now wanted for murder. A federal judge would later write that by this point in his life, Miqal was barely contained by any system. The years of trauma, the thousands of hours in isolation, the untreated mental illness, and the complete absence of any stabilizing force in his life had created someone who placed no value on his own life or anyone else's. By the morning of July 15th, Miqal had crossed into North Carolina. He needed money. He needed supplies. And he had a gun. He drove through Winston-Salem, a city he had never visited before, looking for an opportunity. He had no connection to this place, no knowledge of its people, No awareness that he was about to destroy a family that had already endured more loss than any family should bear. That same morning, in that same city, Christopher Jason Boggs woke up for another day of work at the Exxon station, where he had spent the last 9 years of his life. Christopher had no reason to think July 15, 2004 would be anything other than an ordinary Thursday. Another shift of checking IDs, pumping gas, restocking shelves, and saving money toward a dream that seemed to take longer with each passing year. Christopher Jason Boggs was born in 1975, 8 years before Michal Mahdi entered the world. Christopher was the second of 2 sons born to Nancy Brown in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Like Michal, Christopher would experience devastating loss in childhood. But unlike Michal, he would have a mother who loved him, supported him, and remained present in his life. That difference would shape everything, yet it would not be enough to save him. Tragedy struck the Brown family in 1987 when Nancy's older son died. Christopher was only 12 years old when he lost his brother. The loss devastated the family, shattering the normal rhythms of their lives. Nancy, grieving the death of one son, became even more protective of Christopher. The bond between mother and son strengthened in the aftermath of tragedy. Christopher attended local schools and developed a passion for literature and storytelling. He was quiet by nature, more comfortable with books and films than with crowds and parties. After graduating high school, Christopher pursued a degree in English, demonstrating his love for language and narrative. He read voraciously, analyzed stories, and thought deeply about how tales were constructed and what made them resonate with audiences. But Christopher's true passion was filmmaking. He didn't just want to write stories, he wanted to bring them to life on screen. He dreamed of attending the prestigious UNC School of the Arts to study film production, learning the technical and artistic skills needed to create movies that would move audiences. He wanted to tell stories that mattered, to capture human experiences on film, to make people feel something real. Film school was expensive, and Christopher came from a working-class family. His mother Nancy had remarried and become Nancy Brown with her husband Paul Brown, but they didn't have the resources to simply pay for Christopher's education. So Christopher did what countless other dreamers have done. He took a job to save money, planning and preparing for the day when he could pursue his passion. Christopher took a job at the Exxon gas station at 140 South Broad Street in Winston-Salem. It wasn't glamorous work. The hours were long, the pay was modest, and dealing with the public meant encountering difficult customers and handling routine transactions that became mind-numbingly repetitive. But Christopher approached the job with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else in his life. Christopher worked at that Exxon station for 9 years. He became a fixture there, someone customers recognized and trusted. He knew the regular customers by name, remembered their preferences, and made small talk that brightened their days. He helped elderly patrons pump their gas, cleaned the store meticulously, and took pride in providing good service. His co-workers described him as quiet and dependable, someone who showed up for every shift and did his job well without complaint or drama. At 29, Christopher was still working toward his dream, still planning for that moment when he could apply to film school. On July 15, 2004, Christopher was working his regular shift at the Exxon station. It was a Thursday, and the summer heat made for a busy day with customers stopping for cold drinks and gas. Christopher handled the routine transactions, restocked shelves, and kept the store clean. He had worked this job for so long that every task was automatic, giving him time to think about his future plans. The store had security cameras, standard for gas stations in urban areas. The system recorded continuously, capturing every customer who entered. Christopher had no reason to think this day would be different from any other. He had no connection to Virginia, no knowledge of a young man named Michal Mahdi, no awareness that a crime spree had begun the day before with a stabbing death in Brunswick County. At 9:15 p.m., a young man walked through the door wearing a sleeveless white t-shirt. He browsed the store briefly before selecting a 40-ounce beer from the cooler. He placed it on the counter where Christopher stood. Following store policy, Christopher asked the customer for identification. At 29, Christopher knew that some young people took offense at being carded, but it was part of his job. As Christopher bent his head to examine the birth date, Mikhail pulled out the .380 caliber pistol he had stolen the previous day in Virginia. Christopher never looked up. Mikhail fired point blank into Christopher's face. The 29-year-old store clerk fell backward from the force of the shot. As Christopher collapsed to the floor behind the counter, Mikhail leaned over the counter and fired a second shot. The bullet struck Christopher in the neck as he lay dying. Mikhail reached over the counter and attempted to open the cash register. He pressed buttons and pulled on the drawer, but it wouldn't open. He had killed a man for nothing. No money, no gain, just senseless violence. Frustrated, Mikhail grabbed the 40-ounce beer and walked out of the store, leaving Christopher's body bleeding behind the counter. Christopher Boggs died at the scene. The aspiring filmmaker who had worked 9 years at that Exxon station while saving money for film school would never achieve his dream. His mother Nancy would lose her second son, leaving her with grief that no parent should have to bear twice. After the shooting, Mikhail got back into the stolen station wagon and drove south toward South Carolina. He had the beer he stole, the gun that had now killed 2 people in 2 days, and the stolen car with stolen Virginia plates. The crime spree that had begun with Greg Jones's stabbing in Virginia was accelerating. Winston-Salem police quickly identified Mikhail from the security footage. They issued an arrest warrant for murder and notified law enforcement agencies throughout the region. CCTV had captured clear images of his face, his clothing, and his actions. There was no question about the shooter's identity. As news of the murder spread, investigators in Virginia realized the suspect in the Winston-Salem shooting matched their suspect in the Greg Jones killing. The FBI dispatched agents to search for Mikhail. A multi-state manhunt was underway, but Mikhail was already hours ahead of them, driving through the night toward South Carolina. He had killed 2 men in less than 24 hours. The violence that had defined his childhood and adolescence was now directed outward at random victims. His mental health expert would later note that at this point in his life, Mikhail had completely given up on himself and placed no value on human life, not his own and not others. Mikhail crossed the state line into South Carolina sometime in the early morning hours of July 17, 2004. He had been on the run for 3 days, covering hundreds of miles with 2 murders already behind him. Court records indicate he arrived in Columbia posing as a homeless man to gain access to a shelter. This detail would later come from Mikhail's own statements to his trial team's mental health expert. The shelter gave him a place to rest briefly, but Mikhail couldn't stay still. He was wanted for murder in 2 states. Police were actively searching for him. He needed to keep moving. Around 3:25 a.m. on July 17th, Corey Pitts sat in his red Ford Expedition at a traffic light at the intersection of Bull Street and Washington Street in downtown Columbia. He looked down briefly to find a CD in his car. When Pitts looked up, a gun was pointed at his face. Mikhail had approached the vehicle during that brief moment. He ordered Pitts out of the car. Pitts complied immediately, knowing resistance could get him killed. Mikhail took the keys and climbed into the driver's seat of the Expedition. Before driving away, he retrieved the stolen Virginia license plates from the station wagon and replaced the Expedition's South Carolina plates with them. Now driving a larger, more reliable vehicle, Mikhail headed southeast on Interstate 26. He drove for about 35 minutes before exiting in Calhoun County. He needed gas. The Wilco Hess gas station sat just off the highway, open 24 hours. Mikhail pulled in and attempted to use a credit card at the pump. The pump rejected the card. Mikhail tried again. Rejected. He spent 45 minutes to an hour trying different approaches, pressing buttons, attempting to force the pump to work. Inside the station, clerks watched the man at the pump through the windows. His behavior seemed odd, spending that much time struggling with a pump, growing visibly frustrated, pacing around the vehicle. The clerks called police to report suspicious activity. Mikhail apparently saw them on the phone or sensed their attention. He abandoned the expedition at the gas station and fled on foot into the woods behind the store. He left behind the stolen car with its stolen plates, but he still had the .380 caliber pistol that had killed Christopher Boggs and possibly Greg Jones. Michal ran through the woods for somewhere between a quarter and half mile. The darkness and trees provided cover, but he had nowhere to go. He was in rural South Carolina with no vehicle, no plan, and police likely already responding to the suspicious person call. Then he saw a farm. The property had several buildings, including a main house and a shed. Michal approached the shed and found it unlocked. He went inside. The shed contained a television, some furniture, and a substantial gun collection. Michal spent the day of July 18th hiding in the shed, watching TV and examining the rifles and shotguns stored there. He had no way of knowing whose property he had stumbled onto. The guns should have told him something. This was clearly someone who valued firearms and knew how to use them. But Michal wasn't thinking about whose shed he was burglarizing. He was focused on staying hidden until he could figure out his next move. Unknown to Michal, the owner of the property, James Edward Myers, was at the beach with his family, celebrating birthdays and enjoying a summer day. James Edward Myers had been born in 1948, 35 years before Michal entered the world. While Michal's childhood was being destroyed by violence and neglect, while he was being shuttled between psychiatric hospitals and juvenile detention centers, Myers was building a life of service and dedication in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Myers came of age during the Civil Rights Movement, witnessing his state grapple with integration and change. He developed a strong sense of duty and a desire to help his community during these turbulent years. After high school, he pursued a career in public safety, drawn to the idea of protecting others and making a positive difference. In 1974, the same year Michal was being born into a home already marked by violence, Myers joined the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety. It was the beginning of what would become a 30-year career, defined by dedication and quiet competence. The department combined firefighting and law enforcement, requiring officers to be trained in both disciplines. Myers excelled at both, earning the respect of colleagues and the community. Over 3 decades, Myers rose through the ranks to become a captain. His obituary would later describe his leadership style as marked by quiet leadership by positive example that earned the admiration and respect of his superiors and those who served under him. He provided service above self to the Orangeburg community, a stark contrast to the self-destructive path Michal was being forced down by circumstances beyond his control. In 1993, Myers attended the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. Upon graduation, he received the J.P. Strom Award, the Academy's highest award for excellence. He served as captain in charge of the Special Operations Division and as commander of the Patrol Division. For over a quarter of a century, Myers gave himself to his community. But Myers wasn't defined solely by his badge. He was a man of many talents and interests. He was skilled in woodworking, creating pieces with his hands that his family treasured. He was a member of First Baptist Church. He loved nature and the outdoors. He was a hunter, fisherman, and scuba diver. He particularly loved the land he owned in Calhoun County off Highway 21. The property was his sanctuary, a place where he could wind down after difficult shifts, work the land, and enjoy the peace of rural South Carolina. In 2003, at age 55, Myers met Amy Tripp. Their connection was immediate and deep. After decades of service to his community and dedication to his family, Myers had found someone who shared his values and his vision for a peaceful future. They married in a ceremony that took place in the shed on Myers's Calhoun County property. The rustic setting reflected Myers's love of the land and simpler things. The wedding was small and intimate, focused on the couple's commitment rather than elaborate celebration. If you're finding this documentary informative, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support allows me to continue producing comprehensive, factual, true crime content. Drop a comment with your thoughts, I read every one. Now, let's continue with what happened next. The day after Valentine's Day in 2002, Myers and Amy had celebrated their newly constructed shed. Jim and I looked at the newly raised walls of our shed, hugged each other, and like giddy children full of hope, scratched our names in the freshly poured concrete. Amy would later testify. Those names were scratched just a few feet from where Myers would take his last breath. Myers had a daughter, Meredith, from a previous relationship. Meredith had married and had a daughter named Layla. Myers adored his granddaughter, and being Papa brought him immense joy. In the summer of 2004, he took Layla fishing on his property. A photo captured the moment when Layla caught her first fish, Myers beaming with pride beside her. Meredith kept that photo by her bed, a precious memory of her father's love and patience. Myers had recently acquired baby ducklings for his property. He checked on them regularly, nurturing them as they grew, ensuring they had food and water and protection from predators. His sister Jan and daughter Meredith knew him as a man with wisdom beyond his years, someone who loved nature and approached life with thoughtfulness. Even small creatures deserved care and attention in Myers's worldview. On July 17, 2004, Myers spent the day at Edisto Island with Amy, his sister Jan, and his daughter Meredith. They were celebrating birthdays, a joyful gathering of the people Myers loved most. It was the kind of day Myers treasured, time with family, away from the stress of his job, simply being together. The group laughed and enjoyed the summer sun, making memories that would have to last a lifetime. As evening approached on July 18th, Myers told his family he needed to head back to check on the ducklings. It was typical of his caring nature. Animals depending on him, responsibilities that couldn't wait. He kissed Amy goodbye and made the drive from Edisto back to their Calhoun County property. Myers arrived at his property around 6 p.m. He parked his unmarked 2003 Dodge Ram 2500 police truck and walked toward the shed where he and Amy had married, where they had scratched their names in concrete, where they had dreamed of building a future together. He had no way of knowing that someone was inside, someone whose life had been the mirror opposite of his own. Captain James Myers opened the shed door to check on his ducklings. Mikel Mahdi stood waiting with one of Myers's own rifles in his hands, a .22 caliber weapon from the gun collection stored in the shed. Myers had seconds to process what was happening before Mikel opened fire. The first bullet struck Myers in the torso, then another, and another. Mikel fired 9 times total, with 3 of the shots striking Myers in the head. The captain fell to the floor of the shed, the same shed where he had married Amy just 15 months earlier. The same shed where they had posed for wedding photos, surrounded by family and friends, beginning their life together. Myers died quickly from the multiple gunshot wounds. But Mikel wasn't finished. He found a container of diesel fuel in the shed and poured it over Myers's body. Then he lit it on fire. As flames consumed the body of the 56-year-old police captain, Mikel went through Myers's belongings. He took Myers's police badge, he took the keys to the Dodge Ram, he selected 2 rifles from the gun collection, including a Ruger 223 assault rifle. Then he got into Myers's unmarked police truck and drove away from the property, heading south toward Florida. Amy Myers began to worry when her husband didn't return home for dinner. James was reliable, always calling if he was going to be late. She tried his cell phone. No answer. Hours passed. Her worry turned to fear. She decided to drive to the Calhoun County property to check on him. Amy arrived at the property sometime between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. She saw James's truck was gone, but noticed the shed door was open. As she approached, she smelled smoke. Then she saw the horror inside. Her husband lay on the floor of their wedding shed, his body burned, surrounded by blood. Amy's screams brought neighbors and eventually police. Calhoun County Sheriff Thomas Summers received the call that evening. When he arrived at the scene, he found a devastated widow and a crime scene that shocked even veteran law enforcement. Myers had been shot multiple times, including execution-style shots to the head after he was already down. The body had been deliberately set on fire. The killer had stolen Myers's police badge, his truck, and his weapons. Sheriff Summers, who was in his first term, later said that Mahdi's slaying of Myers was a watershed moment for police at the time. It sent a message that such violence could happen to anyone, even experienced officers on their own property. The brutality was shocking. Myers wasn't killed in the line of duty responding to a call. He was ambushed in his place of peace by someone who had broken into his shed. Investigators quickly processed the scene. They found shell casings, blood evidence, and the remains of the diesel fuel container. The gas station less than a mile away reported that a suspicious man had abandoned a stolen Ford Expedition just hours earlier. Witnesses described a young black male who fled into the woods after his credit card was rejected. The timeline fit perfectly. Police checked the abandoned Expedition and found it had been stolen in a carjacking in Colombia earlier that morning. Corey Pitts had already reported the theft. The vehicle had Virginia plates that didn't match its registration. Those plates had been stolen along with a station wagon on July 14th. When investigators ran the license plates through databases, they connected to the Winston-Salem shooting of Christopher Boggs. Security footage from the Exxon station showed the same person who witnesses described abandoning the Expedition. The FBI manhunt now focused on a triple murder suspect driving a police vehicle. McCall had maybe a 4-hour head start before law enforcement identified him as Captain Myers' killer. He drove south through South Carolina into Florida, staying on highways where an unmarked police truck wouldn't draw attention. Inside the truck, he had Myers' Ruger 223 assault rifle and other weapons. He had no destination, no endgame, just the desperate flight of someone who knew capture was inevitable. On July 21, 2004, 3 days after killing Captain Myers, Mick Al-Mahdi was driving through Satellite Beach, Florida, a small coastal city south of Cocoa Beach. Someone called the Satellite Beach Police Department to report a reckless driver in a white pickup truck. Officers responded to the call, not initially knowing they were about to confront a multi-state murder suspect. When police spotted the Dodge Ram matching the description, they ran the plates. The vehicle came back as stolen and connected to multiple homicides. Officers immediately called for backup and approached with extreme caution. Sergeant Jeff Pearson was among the responding officers who cornered McCall on the 5th floor of a nearby condominium resort. McCall jumped out of the truck holding the Ruger 223 assault rifle he had stolen from Captain Myers. For a moment, it appeared he might open fire on the officers. 6 police officers had weapons drawn, along with at least one K-9 unit. McCall looked at the odds: 6 officers, a police dog, multiple angles of fire, and made a calculation. He dropped the rifle and ran. Officers and the K-9 unit chased him through the resort. McCall made it up to the 5th floor before the officers tackled and subdued him. As they placed him in handcuffs, Mickle was breathing hard from the chase, but didn't resist the arrest. After securing Mickle, one of the arresting officers learned what the suspect was wanted for in South Carolina. The officer mentioned to McCall that he was grateful he hadn't shot at them. McCall's response was chilling. "There were 6 of y'all, 1 of me." He explained that the rifle was set on a 3-round burst, and he didn't think he could successfully shoot 2 officers and their K-9 and get away with it. The statement revealed McCall's thinking. He had considered opening fire, he had done the math. The only reason he surrendered was because he calculated the odds of success and decided they weren't in his favor. If fewer officers had responded, or if he thought he had a better chance of escape, he might have tried to shoot his way out. Florida authorities processed McCall and prepared for his extradition to South Carolina. The physical evidence was overwhelming. They recovered Captain Myers' stolen truck, his stolen Ruger 223 rifle, and his other weapons. Inside the truck, investigators found items belonging to Myers. They found the Virginia license plates. Everything connected McCall to the crime spree across 4 states. While McCall sat in a Florida jail awaiting extradition, 3 families tried to comprehend their losses. Nancy Brown had lost her second son, Christopher, shot to death for checking an ID. Captain Myers' widow Amy and daughter Meredith struggled with the horror of what had happened in their wedding shed. And in Virginia, Greg Jones's family wondered why no one was being charged for his murder. On July 22, 2004, hundreds of police officers with black bands across their badges gathered at First Baptist Church in downtown Orangeburg for Captain Myers's funeral. A Charleston police bagpipe group played as an honor guard carried Myers's flag-draped casket into the church. Dozens of police cars, motorcycles, and trucks surrounded the building near the city square on Russell Street. Burial followed at Memorial Park Cemetery. Amy Myers, supported by her brother John Tripp and Myers's sister Jan, tried to process the impossible. She had found her husband's burned body in the shed where they married. She would later testify at Mikal's trial about the trauma of that discovery, how the images haunted her, how she could never return to that property without seeing it all again. Meredith Myers had lost her father but faced another layer of pain. Her 3 younger daughters, born after July 2004, would never know their grandfather. Myers would never teach them to fish like he taught Layla. He would never make them woodwork treasures with his skilled hands. He would never share his wisdom with them. In Winston-Salem, Nancy and Paul Brown held a much smaller service for Christopher. Nancy had now buried both her sons. Christopher's dreams of film school died with him in that Exxon station. His co-workers remembered him as quiet and dependable. His family remembered his creativity and ambition. All of it ended because a stranger needed beer and had a gun. Greg Jones's family in Virginia got no closure at all. Prosecutors decided not to charge Mikal with that murder because the evidence in the Carolina cases was so strong and likely to result in death penalties. The knife with Mikal's DNA and Jones's blood sat in an evidence locker, proof of a crime that would never be formally prosecuted. This decision meant Jones's family never got their day in court. Following the murders, a Calhoun County grand jury indicted Mikal on August 23, 2004 for murder, second-degree burglary, and grand larceny. The South Carolina Supreme Court assigned Circuit Court Judge Clifton Newman to preside, and attorneys Carl Grant and Glenn Walters were appointed to represent Mikal. First Circuit Solicitor David Pasco led the prosecution and had no doubt this warranted the death penalty given the ambush nature of the killing, Myers being a police officer, the burning of the body, and theft of police weapons. The trial faced delays when Carl Grant suffered serious injuries in a motorcycle accident and had to withdraw. Glenn Walters became lead counsel with Joshua Cogar Jr. as second chair, giving Cogar only 4 months to prepare. The defense team was relatively inexperienced in capital cases, with Grant recalling involvement in only 1 prior death penalty case. From November 26-29, 2006, extensive jury selection took place from a pool of 400 potential jurors. Judge Newman questioned each about their views on the death penalty and ability to follow the law. On November 30, 2006, before the jury was sworn, court security discovered a homemade handcuff key in Mikal's pocket that he had made in prison and transported in his mouth, intending to use it to escape. This prompted authorities to place him in leg irons and chains for the remainder of proceedings. That same morning, defense attorney Walters requested time for Mikal to consult with his grandmother about a major decision he was considering. The next day, before any witnesses could be called, Mikal stunned everyone by announcing through his attorneys that he wanted to plead guilty to all charges. This surprised the courtroom since the state had prepared an extensive case with witnesses ready to testify. Judge Newman conducted a competency hearing to ensure Mikal understood his decision and was mentally capable of making it, then proceeded with the plea colloquy, where Mikal formally admitted to murdering Captain Myers, burglarizing his shed, and stealing his property. With the guilty plea accepted, the only remaining question was sentencing, whether Mikal would receive life in prison without parole or death. The sentencing phase would begin December 4, 2006, with Judge Newman alone making this ultimate decision since South Carolina law gave sentencing authority to the judge when defendants plead guilty rather than go to trial. On Monday, December 4, 2006, the sentencing phase began. First Circuit Solicitor David Pasco opened by telling Judge Newman that Mikal was a man who had killed before and would kill again if given the opportunity, making clear the state would seek the death penalty. Pasco outlined 4 aggravating circumstances, including that the murder was committed during burglary and larceny, Mikal had a prior violent felony conviction for stabbing Moises Rivera. The murder occurred while committing additional crimes, and Myers was a police officer. Pascoe emphasized that just one aggravating circumstance made Mikal eligible for death, and stated that the most important reason Mikal murdered Myers was because his heart and mind were full of hate and malice, calling him the epitome of evil. Over 2 days, Pascoe called 28 witnesses to build an overwhelming case. Detective Michael Poe from Winston-Salem testified about Christopher Boggs's murder and presented security footage showing Mikal shooting Boggs in the face and firing again as he lay on the floor. Corey Pitts recounted the carjacking, where he looked up from searching for a CD to find a gun pointed at his face. Hess gas station witnesses described the suspicious man who abandoned a stolen vehicle after his credit card was rejected. Law enforcement officers described finding Myers's burned body in the shed, and crime scene investigators presented photos and physical evidence showing the brutality of 9 shots, including 3 to the head, diesel fuel poured over the body, and deliberate burning of remains. Moises Rivera testified about the 2001 stabbing where Mikal attacked him outside an apartment window, stabbing him 6 times, including 5 in the back with a punctured lung, causing him to collapse, coughing up blood, and leaving lasting trauma. Joseph Owen testified that Mikal served only 2 months of his 15-year probation before beginning the crime spree. Amanda Jean Weaver confirmed Mikal was anything but compliant during that brief probation period. Witnesses established Mikal's 1998 standoff with Brunswick County Sheriff's Department, where 15-year-old Mikal told Sheriff Woodley he would kill a cop before he died, which prosecutors used to show a pattern of violence toward law enforcement, despite the statement being made while trying to impress his mentally ill father. The most emotional testimony came from victim impact witnesses. Amy Tripp Myers took the stand, supported by her brother, and testified through tears about finding her husband's body in the shed where they had married, describing him as the love of her life lying lifeless in a pool of blood, and explaining the constant trauma, nightmares, and haunting images. Meredith Myers testified about her father's love of nature and wisdom, how he helped her daughter Layla catch her first fish weeks before his murder, and that her 3 younger daughters born after 2004 would never know their grandfather. Captain Connor eulogized Myers's 30 years of service, quiet leadership, and dedication, with colleagues describing how he mentored younger officers and led by example. Orangeburg Public Safety Chief Wendell Davis spoke about Myers's character and reliability, while Sheriff Thomas Summers described the devastating impact on law enforcement throughout the region. The testimony painted Myers as a dedicated public servant, loving husband and father, skilled craftsman, and man who loved the simple peace of his farm, establishing him as a jewel of humanity whose life had immeasurable value in stark contrast to Mikal, sitting expressionless at the defense table. By Wednesday afternoon, Pascoe completed the prosecution's case, and Judge Newman adjourned after personally visiting the murder scene. On Tuesday, December 5, 2006, Joshua Koga Jr. presented the defense opening statement, with Glenn Walters nodding beside him as Koga briefly outlined their strategy. Koga told Judge Newman they would focus on Mikal's dysfunctional family life, noting his mother deserted him at age 3, leaving him and his brother to be raised by their father. The defense also planned to disprove the prosecution's 4th aggravating circumstance by arguing Mikal didn't know Myers was a police officer, which would mean the killing couldn't be considered a targeted murder of law enforcement. The defense called only 2 witnesses. James Aiken, director of an independent consulting firm specializing in penal institutions, was admitted as a prison adaptability expert and testified that the South Carolina Department of Corrections had systems in place to handle prisoners like Mikal. Aiken painted a bleak picture of Mikal's future regardless of sentence, explaining he would spend his life in maximum security with limited privileges and constant supervision, never being free again, whether sentenced to death or life without parole. The second witness was Marjorie Hammock, an independent social worker who testified briefly about Mikal's chaotic childhood, mentioning his mother leaving at age 3, his father's inability to provide proper care, and his time in juvenile facilities, but her testimony lacked any depth or detail. Hammock didn't explain the full scope of the abandonment, the domestic violence Michal witnessed, or the kidnapping at age 9. She didn't detail the 8,000 hours in solitary confinement, the suicide attempts, the psychiatric hospitalizations, or the complete absence of mental health treatment. She provided only a few bullet points in a surface-level summary that failed to humanize Michal or explain how he became who he was. The defense rested after their entire case lasted approximately 30 minutes, with no family members testifying. Michal's aunt, Sophia G., who could have described the family's dysfunction, was never contacted. His third-grade teacher, Myra Harris, who worked with him after psychiatric hospitalization, was never called. And his fifth-grade teacher, Carol Wilson, who tried to get him help, was never reached. George Smith, who could testify about Sharif Mahdi's mental illness and violent behavior, was never found. And the defense presented no expert testimony about solitary confinement's effects on adolescent brain development, or how childhood trauma increases violent behavior risk by 35 to 44% per adverse childhood experience. The defense never told Judge Newman about Michal asking a police officer for his gun at age 9, never explained that by second grade he was already expressing suicidal thoughts, and never detailed how the juvenile justice system punished rather than treated his mental illness. Years later, Michal's appellate attorneys would describe the defense case as not even spanning the length of a Law and Order episode, and just as superficial, noting that in a proceeding to determine whether a 23-year-old should live or die, his entire life was reduced to less than half an hour of testimony. On Friday, December 8, 2006, Judge Clifton Newman delivered his sentencing decision. The courtroom was packed with Captain Myers' family, law enforcement officers, and media. Michal sat at the defense table showing no emotion as Newman began to speak. Newman started by acknowledging the difficulty of the decision he faced. "My challenge and my commitment throughout my judicial career has been to temper justice with mercy and to seek to find the humanity in every defendant that I sentence." He paused, looking directly at Michal. That sense of humanity seems not to exist in Michaldeen Mahdi. Newman reviewed the evidence presented during the sentencing phase. He noted the aggravating circumstances, the murder during the commission of burglary and larceny, the prior violent felony conviction, the additional crimes committed, and his finding that Michal knew or should have known Myers was a police officer. The judge acknowledged the mitigating evidence presented by the defense, the dysfunctional childhood, the absent mother, the inadequate father. But Newman found these factors insufficient to outweigh the aggravating circumstances. The defendant had a homemade handcuff key discovered in his pocket before the trial. Newman noted, "This showed his intent to escape rather than face justice. The defendant has committed other misbehaviors, including threatening law enforcement officers, all of which prove that he will not adapt or conform to prison life." Newman then quoted the words that would define Michal's fate. "In extinguishing the life, hope, and dreams of Captain Myers in such a wicked, depraved, and conscienceless manner, the defendant Michaldeen Mahdi also extinguished any justifiable claim to receive the mercy he seeks from this court." Newman sentenced Michal to death for the murder of Captain Myers. Additionally, he imposed consecutive sentences of 15 years for second-degree burglary and 10 years for grand larceny. At age 23, Michaldeen Mahdi became the youngest person on South Carolina's death row at that time. Amy Myers, supported by her brother and Myers' sister Jan, wept as the sentence was read. Meredith Firestone, Myers' daughter, closed her eyes. Captain Myers' colleagues sat with grim satisfaction. Justice, at least in legal terms, had been served. In July 2004, Winston-Salem police had issued a murder warrant for Michal in connection with Christopher Boggs' death. The security footage left no doubt about the shooter's identity. However, North Carolina prosecutors agreed to let South Carolina proceed first, since the death penalty was already being pursued there. After Michal's December 2006 death sentence in South Carolina, North Carolina prepared its own case. In December 2011, Michal was extradited to North Carolina to stand trial for Christopher's murder. The extradition required extensive security measures. Mikhail had to be transported from death row in South Carolina to a North Carolina courthouse while chained and under heavy guard. On December 13, 2011, Mikhail appeared in Forsyth Superior Court before Judge Richard Stone. Nancy Brown sat in the courtroom with her husband Paul, waiting to see justice for her son. Amy Tripp Myers, Captain Myers' widow, also attended to support Christopher's family. Mikhail pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. There was no trial, no presentation of evidence beyond what was necessary to accept the plea. The security footage spoke for itself. Mikhail acknowledged shooting Christopher Boggs twice, once in the face as he checked ID and once in the neck as he lay dying on the floor. Judge Stone sentenced Mikhail to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Since Mikhail was already under a death sentence in South Carolina, the life sentence was somewhat symbolic. If the South Carolina death sentence were ever overturned on appeal, the North Carolina life sentence would ensure Mikhail never walked free. With the North Carolina conviction finalized, Mikhail was transported back to South Carolina death row. He now carried convictions for 3 murders across 2 states: Greg Jones in Virginia, never formally charged, Christopher Boggs in North Carolina, life without parole, and Captain James Myers in South Carolina, death sentence. He had been given every possible legal consequence the justice system could impose. He would spend the rest of his life, however long it lasted, in the most restrictive custody the prison system offered. But even maximum security, even death row, even the certainty of eventual execution would not stop Mikhail from continuing the pattern of violence that had defined his entire life. Death row at the Lieber Correctional Institution was supposed to be the most secure housing in the South Carolina prison system. Inmates were confined to their cells 23 hours a day. Movement was restricted and heavily monitored. Officers were trained in specialized procedures for handling the most dangerous criminals in the state. Every protocol existed to prevent exactly what happened on the morning of December 2, 2009. But that morning, a critical security failure nearly cost a corrections officer his life. That morning, death row was short-staffed. Budget constraints and scheduling conflicts meant fewer officers were working than policy required. An officer who had never worked death row before and had not been trained in death row procedures was assigned to search inmates after they were released from their cells for recreation. This officer, unfamiliar with the unique dangers of death row, patted down the inmates' clothes but didn't conduct the more extensive searches that experienced death row officers knew were necessary. Searches that included checking air vents, examining cell fixtures, and thoroughly inspecting any area where weapons could be hidden. This wasn't the officer's fault. He was doing what he'd been trained to do for general population inmates. But death row required different protocols, more intensive searches, heightened awareness. The administration had placed him in a situation he wasn't prepared for, and inmates like Mikhail Mahdi were expert at identifying and exploiting exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities. Among the inmates released that morning were Mikhail Mahdi, 26, and Quincy Allen, 30. Allen was a serial killer who had murdered 4 people in the Carolinas as part of a delusional plan to become a mafia hitman. He had been sentenced to death in 2005. Mikhail and Quincy had been plotting an attack on a white officer for weeks. Prisoners were upset about a new rule requiring that the door to the recreation area remain closed. The inmates had removed metal strips from air ducts and fashioned them into makeshift knives called shanks. Corrections Officer Nathan Sasser was assigned to escort prisoners to the basketball court that morning. Mikhail and Quincy asked if they could go to the court, and Sasser agreed. As the protocol officer, only Sasser had keys to the exterior doors and gates. He escorted the 2 inmates outside alone. Once they reached the basketball court, Mikhail and Quincy attacked. Both men had shanks. Sasser saw the weapons and tried to defend himself. He grabbed Allen's knife, bending the blade, and tried to use Allen's body to block Mikhail's line of attack. But Sasser slipped on his own blood and fell to the ground. He quickly covered his head and neck with his hands for protection as both inmates stabbed him repeatedly. Fellow officers couldn't reach Sasser to help because he was outside alone, the only one with keys to get through the exterior doors and gates. After stabbing Sasser 14 times, Michal and Quincy jumped on the fence and tried to climb over to escape. This gave Sasser enough time to scramble to the door, bleeding from multiple wounds. He got inside, where another officer pulled him to safety in a sally port. Unable to escape, Michal and Quincy ran back inside and started destroying the common area. They tore up 2 televisions and a microwave. They used the plastic backs of the TV sets as makeshift body armor to protect themselves from the prison tactical team racing to respond. Officers tried tear gas first, but it failed to subdue the pair. They then used non-lethal rounds, rubber bullets, to bring Michal and Quincy down. Both inmates were transferred to the Kirkland Supermax facility in Columbia and stripped of all privileges. No outside recreation, no visitation, no phone use, no canteen items. The investigation revealed the planning that went into the attack. The removed air duct strips, the fashioned weapons, the weeks of discussion between Michal and Quincy, all of it showed premeditation. The internal report didn't mention any specific beef with Sasser personally. He was simply the white officer who was vulnerable. Sasser spent 2 days at the Medical University of South Carolina Hospital before going home on medical leave. Later that year, the state sent him and his wife to a corrections conference in Buffalo, where he received an engraved clock in recognition of his bravery. The clock still sat by his bedside years later. The South Carolina Department of Corrections cut Sasser loose in November 2010, saying they could no longer hold his job open for him. He developed severe PTSD and anxiety attacks that made working impossible. He told reporters years later that he still struggled with being in crowds and enjoying life. State investigators charged Michal and Quincy with assault and battery with intent to kill. However, prosecutors decided against taking the case to trial. They noted in a letter to Sasser that both defendants had no reason to modify their behavior since they were already sentenced to death. On June 15, 2009, the South Carolina Supreme Court heard Michal's direct appeal, where he raised a single issue, arguing that Judge Newman improperly considered his initial exercise of his constitutional right to a jury trial when imposing the death sentence, essentially claiming Newman punished him for initially choosing a jury trial before changing his mind and pleading guilty. But all 5 justices unanimously rejected this claim, with Chief Justice Jean H. Toll writing that few cases in her career deserved the death penalty more than Michal's. On July 31, 2024, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued a ruling that would restart executions after a 13-year pause. The court dismissed a lawsuit challenging the state's execution methods and affirmed the constitutionality of both the electric chair and firing squad. 3 justices supported the firing squad and 4 supported the electric chair. The 13-year moratorium had occurred not by design, but because South Carolina couldn't obtain the drugs needed for lethal injection. Pharmaceutical companies refused to sell to state corrections departments after learning their products were being used for executions. The shortage forced the state to explore alternative methods. On September 20, 2024, the moratorium officially ended when Freddie Owens was executed by lethal injection for the 1997 murder of a convenience store clerk. Richard Moore followed on November 1, 2024, also by lethal injection, for a 2001 killing. Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection on January 31, 2025, for a 2001 arson murder. On March 7, 2025, Brad Sigmund became the first person executed by firing squad in the United States in 15 years. Sigmund had been convicted of beating his ex-girlfriend's parents to death with a baseball bat in 2001. He chose firing squad over the electric chair or lethal injection. A doctor pronounced him dead less than 3 minutes after 3 bullets struck his heart. The firing squad method used .308 Winchester 110 grain tap urban ammunition, the same ammunition often found in police rifles. 3 volunteer corrections officers positioned themselves 15 feet from the condemned inmate who was strapped to a chair facing them. A target with a red bullseye was placed over the heart by a doctor using a stethoscope. All 3 officers fired simultaneously. Stephen Bixby, who was scheduled to be executed in May 2025, received an indefinite stay when the South Carolina Supreme Court granted him a mental competency hearing. This left Michal as the next scheduled execution. On March 14, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court set Michal's execution date for April 11, 2025, at 6 p.m. at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. Michal had until March 28 to choose his execution method: lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. If he didn't choose, he would be executed in the electric chair by default. On March 28, 2025, Michal Mahdi made his choice. He selected death by firing squad, following Brad Sigmund's precedent. His attorney, David Weiss, issued a statement explaining the decision. Faced with barbaric and inhumane choices, Michal Mahdi has chosen the lesser of three evils. Weiss said, Michal chose the firing squad instead of being burned and mutilated in the electric chair or suffering a lingering death on the lethal injection gurney. On Friday morning, April 11, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court declined Michal's final appeal. Hours later, Governor McMaster announced he would not grant clemency. No South Carolina governor had granted clemency in the 47 executions carried out in the state since the death penalty resumed in 1976. Michal would not be the exception. His last meal request was ribeye steak cooked medium, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Prison staff prepared the meal that afternoon. Michal ate alone in his cell, knowing he had less than 6 hours to live. Approximately 25 protesters gathered outside the gates of Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia on Friday afternoon. Sister Pamela Smith from the Catholic Diocese of Charleston held signs opposing the death penalty. Cornell law student Catherine McIntyre traveled to South Carolina specifically to protest the execution. Noel Nickel and Ron Kaz sat under an umbrella in the rain, holding vigil. Sabrina Sataro from York clutched the fence, crying as 6 p.m. approached. Inside the prison, preparations proceeded according to protocol. 9 witnesses were escorted to the viewing room. An unnamed member of Captain Myers's family, Calhoun County Sheriff Thomas Summers, a representative from the First Circuit Solicitor's Office, one of Michal's attorneys, and 5 media witnesses including an Associated Press reporter. At approximately 5:45 p.m., corrections officers brought Michal into the death chamber. He wore a black jumpsuit. Officers strapped him into a metal chair with restraints around his waist, ankles, and arms. A doctor used a stethoscope to locate Michal's heart and placed a white square target with a red bullseye over it. Michal gave no final statement. He did not look toward the witness room. His face showed no emotion. At 6:01 p.m., a prison guard placed a black hood over Michal's head. The guard then walked across the small room and pulled up a black shade covering 3 rectangular openings in the wall. Behind the openings, 3 volunteer corrections officers stood with .308 caliber rifles. All 3 had live ammunition. They were positioned approximately 15 feet from Michal, roughly the distance from a basketball backboard to the free throw line. The officers aimed at the red bullseye visible through the openings. Without any countdown or warning to witnesses, all 3 officers fired simultaneously. The shots sounded like a single crack. The bullets pushed the white target into the wound in Michal's chest. Witnesses saw little blood on his black jumpsuit initially. Michal cried out loudly as the bullets struck him. His arms flexed against the restraints. He took several shallow breaths. About 45 seconds after the shots, he groaned again. Witnesses heard him moan softly. His breathing continued for approximately 75 to 80 seconds before he appeared to take one final gasp. A physician entered the death chamber at approximately 6:03 p.m., listened to Michal's heart with a stethoscope, and checked for other vital signs. At 6:05 p.m., 4 minutes after the shots were fired, the physician pronounced Michaldeen Mahdi dead. He was 42 years old. The curtain closed. Witnesses signed official documents confirming they had witnessed the execution. South Carolina Department of Corrections Director of Communications Christy Shane held a brief press conference for media witnesses. Outside, protesters received word that the execution had been carried out. Some wept. Others prayed. If you found this documentary compelling, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of No Way Out. These are stories that need to be told, complex examinations of crime, justice, and the failures that lead to tragedy. Your support allows me to continue producing comprehensive, factual documentaries that go beyond headlines to explore the complete truth of each case. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the Miqal Mahdi case. What stood out to you most? How do we balance accountability with the systemic failures that shaped his life? I read every comment, and your perspectives help shape future episodes. Share this video with anyone interested in true crime, criminal justice, or the death penalty debate. These conversations matter, and the more people engaged with the facts, the better informed we all become. Thank you for watching No Way Out, the Miqal Mahdi case. Until next time, stay informed, stay compassionate, and never stop asking the difficult questions.